No one stays in this house for long, Victoria Hayes said, her voice calm, polished, and so cold it seemed to drain the warmth from the entire room. Jacob Miller stood just inside the grand entrance of the mansion, one hand still on the strap of his worn duffel bag, the other hovering protectively near the pocket where he kept a folded photo of his 8-year-old son. He had been told the job was simple: housekeeping assistance, light personal support, temporary hours, good pay. Nothing about the job description had mentioned the woman in the wheelchair, the armed silence of the mansion, or the 3 people who had quit before dinner. The first assistant had lasted 2 days. The second, less than 1. The third had walked out before sunrise, muttering something about impossible rules and a woman who could turn a room to ice with a single look. Jacob did not look at the polished marble floor or the long staircase rising into the shadows behind Victoria. He looked at her directly. She was beautiful in the kind of way people never forgot, even when they tried. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her expression controlled, her pale blue eyes sharp enough to cut through lies before they were spoken. The wheelchair she sat in was sleek and expensive, but it did nothing to soften the force of her presence. If anything, it made her seem more dangerous, more untouchable. "If you've come here to waste my time," Victoria continued, "you can leave now. I don't need another man pretending he can handle my schedule, my home, or my condition." Jacob felt the weight of her words, but he did not flinch. He had spent the last 6 months trying to survive on short-term work, skipped meals, and prayers he had never needed to say before. His son, Noah, was sleeping in the car parked 3 blocks away with a blanket folded over his small shoulders and a hungry stomach Jacob had promised to fill before the night was over. This job was not just money. It was a way out of the edge of failure he had been standing on for too long. "Then we understand each other," Jacob said quietly. Victoria's brow lifted a fraction, as if she had expected fear, apology, or desperation, but not that. A tense silence settled between them. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck once, the sound hollow and distant. Victoria studied him with the same expression she might use to inspect a cracked glass or a damaged contract. Jacob noticed the heavy curtains drawn shut despite the afternoon light, the untouched tea on the side table, the rigid order of every object in the room. Nothing here looked lived in. Everything looked controlled, and control was often what people reached for when something inside them had already broken. Victoria broke the silence first. "Rules start now," she said. "No unnecessary noise. No touching things without permission. No questions about my private life. And if I tell you to do something, you do it immediately." Jacob nodded once. "And if I need to ask something?" Her mouth tightened. "Then make it worth asking." For the first time that day, something flickered behind her guarded expression, not warmth, not yet, but curiosity. Jacob knew better than to mistake that for trust. Still, as he set his bag down near the entrance and stepped farther into the mansion, he had the strange feeling that this job was not going to be about cleaning rooms or managing schedules. It was going to be about surviving the woman in front of him long enough to discover why everyone else had failed. By the time Jacob Miller reached the end of the hallway, he already understood one thing. Victoria Hayes did not run her house like a home. She ran it like a fortress. Every lamp was placed with exact precision, every door closed with a soft but absolute finality, every surface polished to the point of looking untouched by human hands. Even the silence in the mansion felt trained. Victoria did not ask him if he was hungry, did not offer him tea, and did not bother pretending that this was a normal first day. Instead, she rolled herself into a sunlit sitting room lined with dark bookshelves and pointed to a black leather chair across from her own. "Sit," she said. Jacob obeyed, not because he was intimidated, but because he understood the value of not wasting energy on useless resistance. Noah's face flashed through his mind again. His son had asked if they would finally sleep somewhere warm tonight. Jacob had said yes, because fathers lied sometimes when the truth was too expensive. Victoria watched him with a measured stillness that made it impossible to tell whether she was judging him or simply waiting for him to fail. "I reviewed your application," she said. "Your references are limited. Your background is inconsistent. And yet here you are." "Here I am," Jacob answered. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest of the wheelchair, perfectly composed. "Do you know why the last assistant left before dawn?" Jacob leaned back slightly. "Because you scared them off?" A faint, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. Because they thought I was difficult. And were they wrong? For the first time, Victoria's eyes narrowed with something close to offense. You are in no position to be clever with me. I'm not trying to be clever. Jacob kept his voice calm. I'm trying to understand what I signed up for. That answer, more than any apology, seemed to irritate her. She had expected pleading, obedience, maybe even charm. What she got instead was a man who looked tired, honest, and completely unwilling to flatter her. It unsettled her in a way she did not like. A servant appeared briefly with a silver tray, then disappeared again without a word. Victoria did not touch the coffee. Jacob noticed. He also noticed the faint tremor in her hand before she tucked it away beneath the blanket covering her legs. She saw him notice. Do not stare at me, she said. I wasn't staring. You were observing. That's part of the job. The corner of her mouth twitched, but not into a smile. Into something sharper. Careful, Mr. Miller. People here have a habit of confusing observation with judgment. Jacob said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could be a shield, especially when someone was trying to provoke a reaction. Victoria steered the conversation toward his son next, though she made it sound like an administrative concern rather than curiosity. You mentioned a child in your file, she said. How old? 8. Where is he now? Jacob hesitated only a second. Safe. It was the only answer he was willing to give. Victoria studied him more closely after that, as if his refusal had made her more interested, not less. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the tall windows. Inside, the tension between them tightened with each passing second. She was used to people adjusting themselves to fit her world. Jacob could already tell he would not do that. And somehow, that seemed to be exactly what she had not expected. By late afternoon, Jacob had learned that the real rules of Victoria Hayes's house were not written anywhere. They lived in her tone, in the way she paused before every command, in the way the staff moved faster whenever she entered a room. The mansion did not feel empty because it lacked people. It felt empty because everyone in it had been trained to make themselves smaller. Jacob noticed that before he noticed anything else. Victoria gave instructions with the precision of someone who expected disappointment and had built her life around preventing it. She wanted her water at exactly room temperature, the blinds adjusted to avoid glare, the reading lamp angled a certain way, and the chair by the window left untouched because, as she put it, someone once moved it and ruined the room for an entire week. Jacob said nothing. He did the tasks. Not perfectly at first, but carefully, and with no hurry to defend himself. That seemed to irritate her more than failure would have. When he asked where she wanted the stack of invoices placed, she looked at him as if he had asked a foolish question. You should be able to see that, she said. I can see the desk, he replied. That doesn't mean I know your system. Her eyes hardened. My system is obvious. To you. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. Victoria turned her wheelchair slightly toward the window, as though deciding whether he was worth wasting more energy on. You speak as if you have a choice here, she said. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. I do have a choice. I could leave. Then why haven't you? The question came too quickly, too directly, and for a second Jacob saw the truth of it in her face. She was not only challenging him. She was testing whether he would stay. The answer would matter more than either of them wanted to admit. Jacob folded the cloth in his hands and set it aside. Because I need the work, he said. And because I'm not the kind of man who walks away when something is difficult. Victoria held his gaze for a long moment. There was no softness in her expression, but something in it shifted all the same, like a locked door that had not opened but had begun to loosen. Then the moment broke. A sudden commotion rose from the back corridor, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. One of the staff members rushed into the room, pale and breathless. Miss Hayes, there's a problem in the West Wing. The main power line dropped, and the security system just went offline. Victoria's face changed instantly. Not with panic, with control sharpened into something colder. How long? We don't know yet. Jacob was already on his feet before the sentence finished. He did not know this house, but he knew that whenever electricity failed in a place like this, everything hidden underneath it rose to the surface. Victoria noticed his movement and looked at him with renewed suspicion. You're not needed for this. Maybe not, Jacob said, but I'm already here. For the first time since he arrived, Victoria had no immediate answer. The mansion seemed to hold its breath around them, and in that brief, uneasy pause, both of them understood the same thing. The first real test of whether Jacob Miller could last in Victoria Hayes's house had just begun. The blackout should have lasted minutes. Instead, it stretched into an hour that felt much longer, thick with the kind of tension that made every sound in the mansion seem amplified. Emergency lights flickered on along the hallways, casting the house in a dim red glow that made Victoria Hayes look even more severe than before. Jacob stood near the doorway of the West Wing control room while technicians worked in frustrated silence, checking wires, panels, and security monitors that had all gone dead at once. Victoria had insisted on being present, despite the fact that everyone else in the room moved around her with careful, almost nervous awareness. She hated losing control of anything, and this was no exception. "I want the exact cause," she said to the head engineer, her voice clipped. "Not guesses." "We're still investigating, ma'am," he replied. "Then investigate faster." The engineer looked as though he wanted to argue, but one glance at her expression ended that thought. Jacob noticed something else, though. Beneath the anger, beneath the razor-edged patience she used like a weapon, there was strain. Not weakness exactly. Something more guarded. Something that looked like fear only if you were paying very close attention. A loud crash sounded from the far end of the corridor. Everyone turned. One of the servants had dropped a tray of glassware, the pieces scattering across the floor. Victoria's face tightened instantly. "Too much noise," she said. "Clean it up." The servant hurried to comply, but the panic in her movements only made the atmosphere worse. Jacob stepped forward without thinking and crouched to help gather the broken pieces. "Don't," Victoria said sharply. He paused. "I'm just helping. I didn't ask for help." "I know." He met her eyes. "But someone's going to cut themselves if we leave it like that." The engineer and the servant both froze, waiting for Victoria to explode. She did not. Instead, she stared at Jacob for a moment that lasted too long to be casual. Then she looked away. "Fine," she said at last, though the words sounded like it had been dragged out of her. Jacob finished clearing the glass, while Victoria remained standing in the doorway, her hands clenched around the arms of her wheelchair. The power outage had stripped the house of its polished confidence. Without the lights, without the security screens, the mansion felt exposed, vulnerable. And Victoria seemed to hate vulnerability more than anything he had seen so far. When the engineers finally restored the backup systems, no one breathed fully until the monitors came back online. Relief moved through the staff in a quiet wave, but Victoria did not relax. She dismissed everyone except Jacob and her private nurse, then ordered the nurse to check the battery lines and leave the room. The moment they were alone, Victoria rolled herself toward the window and stared out into the darkening grounds. "Do you know what everyone does when something goes wrong?" she asked without turning around. Jacob kept his voice low. "They panic." No, her reflection in the glass looked distant, almost fragile beneath the mask. "They wait to see whether I will." Jacob said nothing. "If I show even the smallest crack, they start deciding things for me." Her fingers tightened on the wheel. "That is why I do not allow mistakes. That is why I do not allow weakness." Jacob listened, finally understanding that her anger was not the real problem. It was the armor, and beneath it was a woman who had spent so long being watched, managed, and doubted that she no longer trusted anything she could not control. Before he could answer, Victoria turned back to him with cold precision restored. "You may have been useful tonight," she said. "Do not confuse that with trust." Jacob gave a small nod. "I wouldn't dare." But even as he said it, he knew something had changed. The house had shown him a crack in her defenses, and once he had seen it, he could not unsee it. The next morning, the mansion looked almost too calm, as if the blackout from the night before had never happened. The staff moved quietly through the halls, speaking in lowered voices, and Victoria Hayes had returned to her usual place by the window, composed and unreadable, as though nothing in the world had shifted. But Jacob could feel it. Something had changed. Not enough to be called trust. Not even close. Still, the tension between them had taken on a different shape, less like a locked door and more like one that might open if pressed in the right place. Victoria did not mention the outage. Jacob did not bring it up. Instead, she handed him a new list of tasks with the same calm precision as before, though this time she watched him complete them with an attention that felt almost involuntary. He caught her looking twice when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The first time, she looked away immediately. The second, she held his gaze for half a second longer than necessary, as if trying to decide whether he was a threat or simply inconveniently human. Around noon, Victoria asked him to bring the folders from her office. The room was colder than the rest of the mansion, lined with dark wood and shelves filled with reports, contracts, and medical documents arranged with obsessive order. Jacob set the folders on her desk and was turning to leave when one of them slipped open and a page fluttered to the floor. He bent to pick it up, meaning only to return it. What he saw stopped him. It was a medical report, not detailed enough to be private in the legal sense, but private in every way that mattered. A list of treatments, notes about pain, comments about muscle response, mobility, and long-term uncertainty. The kind of document that told a story no one volunteered unless they had to. "Don't read that," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet, but the room seemed to tighten around it. Jacob froze, the paper still in his hand. "I wasn't trying to intrude." "Yet you did." She reached for the page, but not quickly enough to hide the flash of something raw in her expression. Not anger, shame, or something close to it. He handed it back immediately. "I'm sorry." Victoria took the report and placed it on the desk with precise care, as though the movement itself could restore her control. "I don't need your pity," she said. "You won't get it." The answer came before he could stop himself. She looked up, surprised by the firmness in his voice. "I know what it looks like when people decide your life is either tragic or inspiring. They never see you as ordinary. They never just let you be." The room went still. Victoria's expression did not soften, but it changed. Only slightly. Enough for Jacob to notice that his words had landed somewhere beneath her defenses. She looked away first. "You talk too much for a man with my job title," she said. "Then fire me." A faint movement at the corner of her mouth. Almost a smile. Almost not. Tempting. He remained where he was, waiting for the order to leave. But Victoria did not give one. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stared at the rain beginning to fall beyond the glass. "There are days," she said after a long silence, "when I would rather people fear me than feel sorry for me." Jacob stayed quiet, letting the confession settle between them. It was the first thing she had said that sounded less like a command and more like a wound. And for the first time, he understood that surviving in this house might not depend on obeying Victoria Hayes. It might depend on seeing the person she had spent years refusing to show anyone. By the time evening came, Jacob had stopped trying to guess what kind of day Victoria Hayes would have. In her world, calm could fracture without warning, and silence often meant something was about to break. He found her in the conservatory, alone, sitting beneath the glass ceiling as the rain tapped softly overhead. She had dismissed the staff early and asked for no dinner. That alone told him something was wrong. Victoria sat very still, her hands folded over the blanket across her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The room around her was full of shadows and pale reflections, making her look both distant and exposed. Jacob hesitated in the doorway. "You don't have to come in," she said without looking up. "I wasn't planning to leave." That earned him a glance, quick and sharp, but not hostile. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence, steady and soft, like the house itself was breathing. Finally, Victoria said, "I had a brother." Jacob looked at her, but kept quiet. He was older, loud, reckless, the kind of man who thought charm could fix anything. Her voice remained level, but there was something strained beneath it, as if each word had to be lifted from a place she usually kept locked away. "He used to tell me I was too serious, too guarded, too afraid of losing control." She paused, then gave a small, bitter laugh. He was right. Jacob leaned against the wall, giving her space. "What happened to him?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "He left." Jacob waited. "Not by choice," she said after a moment. "He trusted the wrong people. I warned him, and he didn't listen. By the time he realized it, everything was gone. Money, reputation, family." Her hands clenched once beneath the blanket. "He called me after the damage was done. He wanted me to help. And I did, because of course I did. But I also made him feel like an idiot every step of the way." Her voice thinned at the end, the truth of it hitting harder than anger ever could. "He died 3 months later." The words settled between them like something fragile and dangerous. Jacob did not interrupt. He could hear the pain underneath the control, the old regret buried under years of discipline. Victoria kept her eyes fixed on the ring. After that, I decided I would never again depend on anyone who could fail me. Jacob understood then that her rules were not just about order. They were about survival, about building walls so high no one could reach the place where grief lived. That's a heavy way to live, he said softly. It's the only way I know. Maybe, Jacob replied. But that doesn't mean it's the only way. She turned to him then, not with anger, but with a look he had never seen from her before. Something close to exhaustion. Something close to wanting to believe him and not knowing how. You make it sound easy, she said. It isn't. He shook his head. No, but it might still be worth trying. Victoria looked away again, and this time her silence felt different. Less like a wall, more like surrender resisted by habit. Outside, the rain deepened. Inside, for the first time, she had let him see the scar beneath the armor. And Jacob knew that once a woman like Victoria Hayes told you a truth like that, the line between assistance and something much deeper had already begun to blur. The break came 2 nights later, just after midnight, when the house had settled into the kind of silence that only exists in places built to hide things. Jacob was asleep in the guest room down the corridor when a sharp, distant sound tore through the quiet. Not a scream. Not quite. More like the sudden crash of something heavy falling against glass. He was on his feet before he was fully awake. By the time he reached the main hall, the mansion had transformed again, this time from fortress to chaos. Lights flashed on and off in uneven bursts. Somewhere near the east wing, an alarm was shrieking. Staff members hurried in every direction, voices overlapping in panic. Victoria's private nurse was calling her name, while one of the security men shouted that the backup cameras had failed a second time. Jacob did not wait to be told what was happening. He followed the noise toward the conservatory and found Victoria there, pale but upright in her wheelchair, one hand gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles had gone white. The glass doors behind her were cracked from the inside. A tray lay overturned near the floor, and standing in the doorway was a man Jacob had never seen before, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed too neatly to belong to the staff. Mr. Hayes, the man said, almost casually, though his eyes never left Victoria. You should have answered my calls. Victoria's face did not change, but something in the room did. The air sharpened. You were told not to come here, she said. Jacob moved without thinking, stepping between them just enough to make his presence felt. Who is this? He asked. The stranger glanced at him with annoyance, as though Jacob were furniture that had been moved into the wrong room. Nobody important, he said. Victoria's expression turned cold enough to freeze the floor. Leave. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Not until you sign what I brought. He held up a folder. There are decisions that need to be made, Victoria. About the estate. About your care. About what happens if you continue refusing reasonable recommendations. Jacob saw her shoulders tighten. Not from surprise. From fury. Get out, she said. You don't get to give orders anymore. The stranger's gaze flicked briefly to Jacob, then back to her. You're making this harder than it needs to be. People in your condition need help. Sometimes they don't know what's best for them. The words landed like a slap. Jacob saw Victoria's jaw lock, saw the look in her eyes harden into something dangerous. Say that again, she said quietly. The man ignored the warning. You can fight me all you want, but sooner or later someone will decide for you. Before Jacob could step in, Victoria's nurse rushed forward, demanding security. Voices rose. The stranger backed up half a step, still smiling, as if he had already won something no one else had seen. Then he looked at Jacob one last time. You should think carefully about where you stand, he said. Men like you usually disappear when things get complicated. Jacob did not answer. He did not need to, because in that moment, Victoria looked at him, not as staff, not as help, but as the only person in the room who had not tried to control her, and something unmistakable passed between them. Not softness, not yet, but trust under pressure. The kind that begins only when someone stands beside you while everything starts to fall apart. By morning, the mansion had settled into an uneasy calm, but nothing about it felt resolved. The stranger from the night before had left behind a legal folder, 2 unanswered calls, and a heavy silence that lingered in every room like smoke after a fire. Victoria Hayes had not spoken his name once, but Jacob could tell the encounter had shaken something loose beneath her control. She moved through the house with the same precision as always, yet there was a tension in her posture now, a guardedness that looked different from anger. It looked like a woman trying not to be cornered by her own life. Jacob found her in the study just after breakfast, staring at the folder without touching it. The curtains were half open, thin light crossing the desk in pale lines. She did not look up when he entered. "You saw enough last night," she said. "You can leave this alone now." Jacob closed the door behind him. "I'm not here to interfere." That would be a first. He almost smiled, but didn't. "I'm here because you haven't opened the folder." That finally drew her attention. And if someone is pressuring you like that, pretending it's for your own good, then I guess they want something from you. Victoria gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think I need you to explain my own life to me?" "No," Jacob said quietly. "I think you already know what's inside that folder, and that's why you haven't looked." Her expression flickered. Not denial, not surprise, something more dangerous. Recognition. She pushed the folder away as if it had offended her. "It's about the estate, the trust, my care." The kind of language people use when they want to strip dignity from a person and call it planning. Jacob stayed where he was, careful not to push too hard. "Is it true?" Victoria stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Some of it." That was enough to tell him the rest. Someone had found a weakness in the structure of her life and decided to turn it into leverage. And for the first time, he understood why she resisted dependence so violently. To her, asking for help wasn't just vulnerability. It was risk, the kind that could be weaponized. "You don't have to go through it alone," Jacob said. "I didn't say I wanted company." "No, but you did let me stay." The words hung between them. Victoria's face tightened, as though the truth of that irritated her more than anything else. She turned her chair slightly toward the window, then spoke with careful control. "You should know something, Jacob. People get close to me for a reason. Sympathy, money, influence. Sometimes all three." He met her gaze. "And you think I'm here for any of that?" "I think everyone is here for something." "Then maybe you're the one who hasn't decided what I'm here for." That seemed to stop her. For once, she had no immediate reply. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the uncomfortable possibility that she had been wrong about him from the start. Victoria looked down at her hands, then back up, her voice quieter than before. "If I let this go further," she said, "I lose control." Jacob answered without hesitation. "Maybe. Or maybe you just stop carrying it alone." It was the closest thing to an invitation she had ever offered, and the first time he realized that what was changing between them was not simple trust. It was the dangerous beginning of belief. The first thing Victoria Hayes did the following afternoon was unexpected even by the standards of a house that had already seen too much tension to count. She asked Jacob to stay after the staff left. Not as an order. Not exactly. The request came quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the words themselves had to be carried past years of habit before they could leave her mouth. Jacob remained in the study while the last of the household noises faded into silence. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gray, and rain pressed against the windows in thin, steady lines. Victoria sat by the desk with the legal folder still unopened beside her, her hands resting motionless over the blanket on her lap. For a long time, she said nothing. Neither did he. There was no need. The room already held the weight of everything that had happened. The stranger at the conservatory door, the threats dressed as concern, the pressure to surrender her choices to people who believed control could be disguised as care. At last, Victoria lifted her chin. "I don't ask people to stay," she said, "because when I do, they either leave eventually or disappoint me first." Jacob leaned against the wall, keeping his distance. "I know." "No," she said, and her voice sharpened briefly. "You don't know. You only think you do." He waited. Victoria exhaled slowly, as though that single breath cost more than she wanted to admit. "My whole life," she said, "people have treated me like two things. A problem to solve or a story to tell." Her eyes were fixed on the folder, not on him. "The man last night was no different. He spoke as though I were incapable of understanding my own circumstances, as though my body made me lesser, as though I should be grateful for being managed." Jacob said nothing. He could feel how important it was that she keep going. "But you," she continued, finally looking up at him, "you never spoke to me that way." The room seemed to go still around those words. You didn't pity me. You didn't flatter me. You didn't run when I was difficult. A faint, tired expression moved across her face, something so close to vulnerability that it almost disappeared immediately. You stayed. Jacob's throat tightened, though he kept his voice steady. I had nowhere else to be. That should have sounded small. Instead, it landed like something honest enough to matter. Victoria's gaze lingered on him, and for the first time, she did not seem to be measuring him against a standard designed for failure. She seemed to be deciding whether she could believe what she already knew. Noah is waiting for you, she said quietly. Is he? Jacob nodded. Then go home. He hesitated. What about you? Victoria looked past him toward the rain-streaked glass, then back again. For the first time in a long time, she said, I'm not asking someone else to decide that for me. It was not a confession, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to freedom she had spoken aloud. Jacob understood then that he had not come to this house simply to do a job. He had entered a life sealed behind walls of fear, grief, and pride, and somehow managed to leave a crack in all of them. Victoria had not become someone new overnight, but she had reached for trust, and that was enough to change everything. As Jacob stepped out of the study and into the quiet hall, he knew the story was no longer about whether he could last a week in Victoria Hayes's house. It was about what happened when a man who had nothing left to prove met a woman who had spent years learning how not to need anyone, and discovered that neither of them were as alone as they had believed.